Theorizing that one could time travel within his own lifetime, Dr. Sam Beckett stepped into the quantum leap accelerator and vanished.
For more than 30 years, fans thought they knew everything about Scott Bakula and Dean Stockwell. They knew the jokes, the chemistry, the way one look between Sam and Al could say more than a whole page of dialogue. What they did not know was that Scott had been sitting on one story, one painful realization about Dean that he simply would not touch in interviews for decades. Only now, in his 70s, does he even come close to laying it out. And once you hear it, you will never watch Quantum Leap the same way again. In public, Scott has always been careful. He does not trash people, he does not stir up drama, and he almost never lets anyone see how hard this business can be behind the scenes. That is why the way he talks about Dean stands out so much. When Dean passed away, Scott did not give a generic Hollywood statement. He called him a dear friend, a mentor, and flat out said that he made him a better human being. That is not the way you describe just another co-star. That is how you talk about someone who carried you through things the audience never saw. But here is where it gets uncomfortable. When you line up everything Scott has said about Dean with the timeline of Dean's life, a darker picture forms. You have a man who was pushed into acting as a child, who walked away from Hollywood more than once because it nearly broke him, who finally finds a late career resurrection by Scott's side, and then ends up sidelined by illness just as the industry decides to cash in on the show they built together. Scott knows every beat of that story. He lived it with him. And the way he talks now feels less like nostalgia and more like a confession that he cannot shake. Why did Scott turn down the new Quantum Leap when the revival finally happened? What did he see happen to Dean over those years that made him draw that line? And what exactly is the regret that seems to sit between every word when he looks back on their time together? To understand that, you have to rewind to a boy who never really got to decide whether he wanted to be famous in the first place. That is where the real damage started, long before Scott Bakula ever walked into a casting room. Before Scott Bakula ever met him, Dean Stockwell had already lived the kind of childhood that leaves permanent marks. He was not discovered by accident. He was placed into the studio system as a young boy and quickly became one of the 1940s most in-demand child actors. By the time he was 10, his paychecks were helping support his entire family. That kind of responsibility would crush most adults, and Dean carried it before he even understood what fame really meant. Studios loved promoting him as the gifted kid who could handle any script. What Dean remembered was something very different. Long days under bright lights, adults telling him where to stand, how to smile, when to cry. While other children went home after school, he stayed behind on sound stages, finishing scenes he never chose. Years later, he would talk about feeling boxed in, shaped into someone the studio needed him to be. As he grew older, he began pushing back. The work felt more like a cage than a career, and he finally walked away, drifting through odd jobs just to find out who he was without a camera pointed at him. At one point, he studied for a real estate license. Hard, unglamorous work that had nothing to do with fame. He was trying to prove he could build a life outside Hollywood. But the industry has a way of pulling its former children back. New offers arrived. Old contacts insisted things would be different. Dean returned, then left again, then returned once more, each comeback wearing him down a little further. By the time Scott Bakula enters the story, Dean is not just a veteran actor. He is a man who has already tried more than once to escape the world that will soon bind their names together. And that contrast, Scott on the rise, Dean on his third or fourth reinvention, is exactly what makes their first meeting so powerful. When Dean Stockwell walked into the network office in 1988, he was not a newcomer trying to catch a break. He was already respected, already Oscar-nominated, and already someone who had walked away from Hollywood before when it disappointed him. Scott Bakula was waiting to see who would play the partner he would spend most of his next 5 years acting beside. Neither man had any idea how much that single meeting would shape the rest of their careers. Scott has always said that Dean did not need to audition, yet still agreed to read for the network. That alone showed how unusual this role was. A veteran with decades behind him was willing to prove himself because something about Al Calavici drew him in. Scott remembers their first interaction simply. They clicked immediately, and from then on, everything felt different. Within months, Dean's late career momentum was building fast, yet he chose to lock himself into a demanding series rather than chase only prestige films. From the start, their dynamic was clear. Scott carried the emotional center of Quantum Leap, leaping into a new life each week. Dean, as Al, brought the spark, the comic timing, the edge, the unpredictability, but off-camera, the partnership was far deeper. Crew members often joked that the day did not really start until Dean walked in. Scott later said he was honored to work with him, calling him a mentor who made him better. Actors do not use words like that lightly. The two of them built the heart of the series almost alone. Every episode came down to their exchanges. One earnest, one world-weary, both completely believable. Yet what looked perfectly balanced from the outside was not balanced at all. Scott was rising fast. Dean was on what might have been his final major run. One man was gaining momentum, the other was spending what he had left. Scott did not understand that difference at the time. He was too focused on keeping up, too deep in the work to see how much Dean was investing just to match him step for step. Only years later would he realize how uneven that partnership truly was, and how much Dean was giving that no one else could see. By the time Quantum Leap was in full swing, the pattern was simple. If you saw Sam, you saw Al. Week after week, year after year, those long shooting days always came back to the same two faces. For Scott, this was the role he had been waiting for. For Dean, it was something far riskier, a full surrender to the very business he had tried to escape more than once. On screen, Al Calavici looked like the fun job. Off-screen, it was the part that forced Dean to dig into parts of himself he had spent years trying to bury. Al was written as a woman chasing, cigar-puffing admiral with a wisecrack for every disaster Sam landed in. That could have been a cartoon. Instead, Dean loaded him with a strange mix of heartbreak and loyalty that did not come from the script alone. He knew what it felt like to be let down, to have your fate decided by people in offices, to watch doors swing open and slam shut for reasons that had nothing to do with your talent. When he looked at Scott across that imaging chamber, that history was sitting right there behind his eyes, even when he was delivering a joke. Viewers laughed. They also believed him, and that belief did not come for free. The schedule was brutal. Early mornings, late nights, constant new settings. Scott was in almost every scene. Dean was never far behind. They pushed through exhausting weeks where there was no time to process anything that was happening in their own lives. Scott has always talked about how grateful he was to have Dean walking beside him through that grind. What he did not fully grasp at the time was that Dean was older, carrying more miles on his body and his mind, and that every extra season he signed on for was another gamble against burnout and disappointment returning. Yet Dean kept showing up, hitting his marks, turning Al into the soul of the show's conscience. When Sam wanted to give up on a leap, it was often Al who pushed him to try one more time. When an episode ended on a bittersweet note, it was Dean's tired smile or shaken voice that made it land. Fans saw that bond and assumed both men were being lifted in the same way. The reality was much harsher. Scott's star was rising. Dean was spending a precious final chapter of his career, pouring everything he had left into a role that might have been his last great stand. Scott only really started to talk about that imbalance years later. At the time, he was just trying to keep up. He could not see how much weight Dean was carrying so that he did not have to. That realization would hit much harder once the show ended, and the way it ended left a mark on both of them that never really faded. For a long time, it felt like Quantum Leap could run forever. There were always more lives to step into, more wrongs to set right, more chances for Sam and Al to argue, laugh, and walk out of another day together. Then, almost without warning, it was over. Not with a grand farewell or a carefully planned final bow, but with an episode that left millions of viewers staring at their screens in disbelief. One simple line on a title card did more damage than anyone expected, and Scott and Dean were just as stunned as the fans who had cleared their weeknights around that show. In the last episode, Sam jumps into a small-town bar that feels more like a dream than a leap. The rules are different. The people are familiar. The story bends toward something bigger than just one mission. By the end, Sam is given a choice that changes not only his life, but Al's entire history. He reaches across time to fix the one thing that has haunted his friend for years. He makes sure Al's wife Beth never gives up on him while he is a prisoner of war. In that moment, the series does something beautiful. It rewrites Al's heartbreak into a second chance. Then comes the part that still stings. Instead of a warm reunion, or a scene of Sam finally stepping back into his own life, the episode throws up a black screen and a line of text that fans still argue about. Dr. Sam Beckett never returned home. For a series built on hope that felt like a punch in the chest. Even the way his name was handled in some versions of that card made it seem rushed, almost careless. It was as if the show that had poured so much care into the details of every leap suddenly shrugged at its own ending. For Scott and Dean, that was not just a creative choice. It was personal. They had given 5 years of their lives to those characters. They had stayed late, come in early, and shouldered the emotional load of stories that often went much darker than people remember. To have it all wrapped up with a sentence that cut off Sam's homecoming and left Al's future implied, but unseen, was a shock. Scott has spoken over the years about finding a way to see the ending as hopeful. Imagining Sam still out there helping people, you can hear him trying to make peace with it. At the same time, you can sense that the lack of real closure never completely sat right. For Dean, it was another chapter that ended without the kind of resolution he deserved. Once again, he had thrown himself into a project. Once again, the finish line arrived faster than anyone expected. And once again, the industry moved on. There was no big farewell special, no carefully controlled goodbye tour. One week, he was on the call sheet. The next week, he was a piece of television history the network was content to box up. That is the part fans did not see. When a finale lands badly with the audience, actors feel that weight twice. They feel their own disappointment, and the knowledge that the characters they built are now frozen in a way they cannot change. Scott did what many leading men do. He kept working, took new roles, tried to carry the lessons forward, but that ending left a mark. It sealed Sam in a kind of permanent limbo, and, in a strange way, did the same to Scott's memory of that time. There was no real chance to say goodbye on screen, no last look across the imaging chamber, just a sentence that closed the door. That unfinished feeling would come roaring back years later, when Hollywood decided to bring Quantum Leap back, without the man who had defined Al, and without the partner Scott still was not ready to let go of. After Quantum Leap ended, both men went their separate ways, but the connection between Scott Bakula and Dean Stockwell never really loosened. They found each other again, in guest roles, in conventions, in quiet moments far from the cameras. And then, without warning, Dean's life took a sharp turn. A stroke in the mid-2000s forced him into retirement, cutting short a 70-year career he never fully controlled. In the first place, he slipped out of the spotlight the same way he had entered it as a child, not by choice, but because something bigger than him decided the timing fans did not know how serious it was at first. What was supposed to be a short break became a permanent step away. Scott kept working, but whenever Dean's name appeared in interviews, something in his voice changed. He talked about him not as a former co-star, but as if he were talking about a brother he could not help anymore. When Dean passed away in 2021, it hit Scott harder than anyone realized. His tribute was long, unusually personal, and filled with details only someone who had leaned on Dean for years would know. He talked about their long days, their shared pressure, the way Dean could carry a whole room just by walking into it. But buried in those tributes was the thing Scott had avoided saying for decades, that he owed far more of his career and far more of his stability to Dean than he had ever admitted while Dean was alive. Then came the moment that made fans start asking questions. NBC revived Quantum Leap, and for the first time in 30 years, a door opened for Scott to return, even just for a cameo, even just to bring Sam Beckett home. Instead, he turned it down outright. He made a polite statement wishing the new team well, but the message beneath it was unmistakable. Without Dean, it was not his story anymore. He did not want to stand on a set where Al Calavici existed only as a reference, a photograph, or a piece of exposition. He had no interest in reviving something that had been built on a partnership that could never be recreated. And that is the part he finally hints at now, the part he never said when both of them were younger and the world expected them to keep moving. The devastating truth is not some hidden scandal or secret fight. It is the realization that everything Scott became during those 5 years, the confidence, the steadiness, the ability to carry a show that demanded everything from him, was shaped by a man who had already paid the price for fame long before they met. Dean held up his half of their world even when his own life was falling apart outside the frame. Scott did not see it clearly back then. He was too busy running from leap to leap, from call time to call time. Now, looking back at 71, he sees the imbalance for what it was. He sees that the role which launched him forward was, for Dean, the last long stretch of a career spent fighting against forces that started pulling at him when he was a child. He sees the weight Dean carried, so the show never collapsed. He sees how quickly the industry moved on when Dean could no longer give it everything. And he knows the one thing he cannot change, that the person who taught him how to survive the pressure, how to stay grounded, and how to be better than the business around him, is gone. Scott Bakula will always be Sam Beckett, but the man who made that possible, the one who steadied the show, the one who paid the emotional cost that no audience ever saw, that was Dean Stockwell. And the truth Scott finally admits now is simple and painful. He did not just lose a co-star. He lost the person who held the other half of his story, the part he did not understand until it was too late to tell him.